Sit down, you can't stand here. You don't even belong here, and you're causing a nuisance already. The flight attendant, Meredith, shouted angrily at the black woman seated in first class. The flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face flushed with anger. I said, "Sit down," she snapped, physically pushing Eleanor's shoulder, forcing her back into her seat, and spilling a pitcher of water across her lap. Eleanor, drenched in water, sat there in shock as her designer suit was soaked, along with the important legal documents she had been carrying. The entire first-class cabin remained silent. No one spoke up in her defense. Not a single passenger, not one airline staff member. All eyes were on her, judging her as the problem. You people need to learn your place, the flight attendant hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. What no one on that flight knew was exactly who Eleanor truly was, and the immense power she held in her hands. Everything changed with one simple phone call, a call made with quiet authority only possible from someone who had worked within the highest levels of the federal bench for decades. With one phone call, one command, the entire airline was brought to its knees. The scene that followed was nothing short of chaos. The airline grounded every single flight. Thousands of passengers were stranded. News crews rushed in, swarming the crisis, unsure of the magnitude of the storm they had just witnessed unfold. It was all because one woman, one powerful woman, decided enough was enough. If you've ever been disrespected, overlooked, or treated unfairly because of who you are, and you've stood against injustice, type power in the comments. Tell us what country you're watching from. This story isn't just about what happened on Flight 2187. It's about the moment when systemic discrimination met its match in federal judge Eleanor Washington, a woman who spent her life working to change the very system that had now wronged her. Before we dive into the events that led to this extraordinary moment, take a second to like this video and hit that notification bell. The justice that was served here is something you won't want to miss. Part 2, extended to 5,000 characters. It all began on a routine Tuesday morning at Atlanta International Airport. Judge Eleanor Washington had just wrapped up a grueling 3-week civil rights case. It was a landmark decision that would help countless families fight housing discrimination. She was exhausted but satisfied with the verdict she had delivered. Little did she know, her greatest test of justice wouldn't come in her courtroom, but in the first-class cabin of Flight 2187. At 62, Eleanor had the posture and poise that came with over 2 decades of service on the federal bench. Her silver-streaked natural hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Despite the summer heat in Atlanta, her navy pantsuit was impeccable, showing the kind of dignity that only years of hard work could foster. The slight shadows beneath her eyes were the only remnants of the exhausting civil rights trial she had just presided over. In her leather briefcase, she carried the final opinion she'd handed down just yesterday, a ruling that would protect hundreds of families from housing discrimination. All she wanted now was a quiet flight back to Washington, D.C., to sleep in her own bed. Inside the airplane, flight attendant Meredith Keller was already in a foul mood. At 34, she had been working for the airline for nearly a decade. Her morning had begun with complaints about the special requests she had to attend to in first class. "These entitled passengers think we're their personal servants," she had said to a colleague, rolling her eyes as she vented. "Especially the ones who clearly don't belong up front." Unaware of the consequences of her words, Meredith continued on her path of prejudice. As first-class passengers boarded, Eleanor made her way down the aisle. She carried herself with practiced grace. Finding her seat in 3C, an aisle seat she had specifically requested for her occasional need to stretch due to circulation issues. As she sat, she noticed the small, almost imperceptible shift in the older businessman seated beside her. His body moved slightly toward the window, creating an extra inch of space. It was a small gesture, but one Eleanor had grown all too familiar with in her decades as a black woman in America. She'd learned to detect the subtle signs of discomfort, the microaggressions that could not be ignored. Meredith began offering drinks to first-class passengers, moving through the aisle with the same warmth and efficiency she'd shown to everyone else. That was until she reached Eleanor. "Water, please," Eleanor said politely, as Meredith's gaze slid past her to the businessman in 3D. He smiled, received his drink, and Eleanor's request remained ignored. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. She knew how these situations worked. She could let it go, or she could speak up. But that day, she chose not to ignore it. "Excuse me, I had asked for water earlier," Eleanor called out. Meredith, however, responded with a cold smile. "We're preparing for departure now. I'll get that for you once we're in the air." Yet, just seconds later, Meredith was hurrying to deliver a last-minute coffee to the man in 2B. The double standard was clear, and Eleanor could feel the weight of every slight accumulating. The kind of prejudice that isn't always overt, but exists in the small, quiet refusals. The kind that leaves its targets questioning whether they're imagining it. As the cabin continued to settle, Eleanor reflected on how much of this moment felt like an echo of the countless indignities she had faced in her life. Whether it was in the courtroom or in the streets, discrimination took many forms. Sometimes it was explicit, but more often it was subtle, just like this moment. Meredith was continuing her round of drink services when she finally came back around to Eleanor. This time, Eleanor felt a wave of frustration rising in her chest. She raised her hand. "Excuse me, I still haven't received my water," Eleanor repeated calmly. Meredith, now clearly irritated, answered without meeting her eyes. "I'll get to you shortly," she said, almost dismissively, and so Eleanor continued waiting. But with every passing second, it became harder and harder to remain silent. The water service passed by Eleanor again. Every other passenger had been served, but not her. 10 minutes passed, and the flight attendants had finally moved on to the meal service. They returned to Eleanor, handing her a half-filled plastic cup of water. No ice, no napkin. Nothing to make her feel like a valued passenger. Nothing to make her feel human. Eleanor glanced around at the other passengers, who had full glasses of drinks, fresh towels, and napkins. Everything about this moment felt wrong. It was so blatant, so stark, that Eleanor wondered how she had been so naive not to see it earlier. As Meredith began serving the meal, Eleanor's thoughts returned to the Anderson case. She had fought so hard for families who had been systematically denied housing. But here she was, being denied the simple courtesies everyone else around her received. It was a reminder that no matter how high up you climbed, no matter how much work you put into fighting the system was always there to keep you in your place. The quiet, insidious power it held was a force that could never truly be beaten without confrontation. The flight continued, and with each passing minute, the small slights accumulated. Eleanor could feel her patience beginning to wear thin. Every moment, every microaggression felt like a reminder that no matter how far she had come, the system was still built to hold her down. As the meal service began, Meredith came down the aisle once again, delivering pre-selected meals. She was all smiles as she handed out food to other passengers, but when she reached Eleanor, her demeanor shifted. Eleanor had pre-ordered a vegetarian meal when booking her ticket, as was her usual routine for dietary reasons. But when Meredith came to her, she delivered the worst news yet. "We don't have any special meals left," Meredith said, dismissing her with a curt tone. Eleanor, already feeling the weight of the many slights, simply looked around. The other passengers, even those sitting around her, had been served their meals. The business people, in their crisp suits, had full plates of food, while Eleanor's seat remained empty. Eleanor was taken aback, but tried to remain composed. "I requested a vegetarian meal when I booked my ticket," she said calmly. "Could you please check again?" Meredith, clearly frustrated with the inconvenience of it all, simply shook her head and raised her voice just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We don't have any left. You'll have to take what's available." Her words were harsh, dismissive, as though Eleanor's simple request was a burden. Meredith handed her the only thing left: a bread roll and a side salad, no dressing, no utensils. It was the kind of treatment one would expect for a person who didn't belong, for someone who wasn't deemed worthy of the same service as the others. This moment hit Eleanor harder than any of the others had. It wasn't just the lack of a meal, it was the insult to her dignity. When she looked down at her tray table, she noticed it was crooked, tilting awkwardly to one side. It was something simple, something that could easily be fixed. But when Eleanor called Meredith's attention to it, Meredith responded with nothing short of disdain. "It's not my job to fix the equipment," she snapped. "You'll have to deal with it." The frustration bubbled up inside of Eleanor, but she swallowed it. The weight of what was happening, what had been happening all along, was starting to overwhelm her. It wasn't just about the small indignities anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about a system that allowed this behavior to go unchecked. And it was about to get worse. Eleanor, trying to keep calm, noticed that the seatbelt sign had gone off. She'd been waiting for this moment. She had medication in the overhead bin that she needed to take for her high blood pressure. She stood up carefully, reaching for her carry-on. Before she could open the bin, she heard Meredith's voice, sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, sit down now." The command was loud, almost like a reprimand, a tone Eleanor had heard before, but never from a flight attendant. She stopped in her tracks, confused. "I need to retrieve my medication," she explained calmly. "The seatbelt sign is off. Other passengers are moving about the cabin." Meredith, however, wasn't having it. The turbulence could return at any moment. "You need to return to your seat immediately," she said with finality, her tone filled with authority. Eleanor looked around, seeing that other passengers were standing and moving freely in the cabin, but Meredith's gaze was fixed on her, demanding compliance. The double standard was clear, and Eleanor knew that at that moment she had to make a choice. Would she back down, or would she stand her ground? The businessman seated across from her, the one who had shifted away from her earlier, glanced over at her, his eyes filled with judgment. "Just listen to the staff, lady," he said dismissively. The words stung more than anything. This man who had witnessed everything unfold and said nothing, was now telling her to submit, to obey. But Eleanor had reached her breaking point. She stood up again, walking slowly toward the overhead bin. She had every right to get her medication, every right to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger on that plane. And then, just as she was about to open the bin, Meredith rushed down the aisle again. This time, she wasn't just commanding her to sit down. She physically pushed Eleanor back into her seat. The pitcher of water she had been holding tilted over, spilling cold water onto Eleanor's lap, onto her clothes, and most devastatingly, onto the legal documents she had been carrying. Papers that represented the future for families who had been discriminated against for years. Eleanor gasped in shock as the water soaked through her suit and onto her skin. The papers, the ones she had worked so hard on, now lay in a ruined, sodden heap. Meredith didn't apologize. Instead, she turned to the cabin as though Eleanor was the one who had caused the disruption. "I apologize for the disturbance, folks," Meredith said, addressing the entire cabin, as if she were trying to make Eleanor the villain. The gaslighting was incredible. It was as though Meredith was trying to convince everyone that Eleanor had done something wrong. The passengers around her began to murmur in agreement. "These people always have to make a scene," one man muttered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. The cabin erupted in complaints, not about Meredith's behavior, but about the disturbance Eleanor had supposedly caused. Not a single person came to her defense. No one spoke up. But Eleanor wasn't just humiliated. She wasn't going to let this go. Not today. Not when she had fought so hard for justice. It was time for the system to face what it had done, and for the people around her to see the truth. Eleanor's posture was no longer just dignified. It was a silent statement of power. The cold water soaked through her clothes. But what was worse was the realization that it wasn't just a personal insult. It was systemic. Her life's work, her recent ruling in the Anderson case, was now ruined. The legal documents she'd been carrying were drenched, the ink running into a puddle of irreparable mess. Eleanor remained still, even though the humiliation stung deep. She wasn't just a passenger now. She wasn't going to sit silently while the system, which she had spent years fighting to reform, continued to treat her as less than human. She noticed that no one spoke up. Not a single person offered support. The passengers had watched, silently complicit, while Meredith treated her like she didn't belong. It wasn't just Meredith who failed to see her humanity. It was everyone who stood by, choosing not to intervene. Eleanor had fought against this for years in courtrooms, and yet here she was, facing it, in a place she should have felt safe, on a flight. The tipping point came when Meredith blocked her path to the lavatory and ordered her to sit down. "I need my medication," Eleanor said, trying to keep calm. But Meredith insisted, "Sit down now." Eleanor knew she had to stand her ground. When she reached for the overhead bin to retrieve her medication, Meredith physically pushed her back into her seat. The force was uncalled for, and the water pitcher Meredith was holding spilled over Eleanor's lap, soaking her clothes in legal papers. Eleanor's shock didn't come from the water. It came from the realization that this wasn't just a series of insults anymore. This was deliberate. This was physical assault, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Instead of apologizing, Meredith addressed the cabin as if Eleanor were the cause of the disturbance. "I apologize for the disturbance, folks," she said, making Eleanor the villain. A few murmurs of agreement came from the passengers, but not one person defended her. No one spoke up to challenge the blatant injustice. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Eleanor could feel her patience eroding. She wasn't just going to endure this any longer. She wasn't going to be the silent, invisible black woman who suffered in silence while others looked the other way. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Eleanor knew it was time. She stood up again and moved toward the overhead bin to retrieve her medication. Meredith was ready. "Ma'am, sit down now," she commanded. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I need to get my medication," she replied calmly, but her resolve was firm. "The seatbelt sign is off, and I'm not the only one moving around." Meredith refused to let Eleanor go to the bin. She insisted Eleanor return to her seat immediately, using the threat of turbulence to control her. But Eleanor stood her ground. This was about more than medication now. This was about the principle of dignity. And when Meredith physically pushed her back into her seat, Eleanor knew she couldn't let this go. With steady hands, Eleanor reached for her briefcase. Not for legal papers this time, but for something far more powerful. The full weight of her authority. She pulled out a small leather wallet containing her federal judicial credentials. The gold seal of the United States courts gleamed in the light, catching the attention of everyone around her. "I am Federal Judge Eleanor Washington of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia," she announced, her voice unwavering. The entire cabin fell silent. Meredith froze. Her face drained of color as the reality of the situation dawned on her. She hadn't just mistreated a passenger, she had just assaulted a federal judge. The passengers around them, who had silently watched everything unfold, began to realize the gravity of the moment. They had been complicit by their silence. They had let this happen without intervening. Now they were seeing that this wasn't just about an ordinary passenger being mistreated. This was about the system, about the silent discrimination that many, including themselves, had allowed to happen without ever questioning it. Meredith turned to the lead flight attendant, Davis, looking for help. But he took a step back. The realization hit him too. He hadn't just witnessed a conflict. He had witnessed something that would change the trajectory of their careers. Meredith leaned in toward Davis, whispering, "Who's Chairwoman Richards?" Davis's face went pale. "Margaret Richards, head of the National Airline Association. She outranks everyone. Even our CEO, Eleanor's voice carried over the hum of the plane. A quiet, unshakable authority, now imbued in every word. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't even just a judge. She was a force that could bring this entire airline to its knees." As Meredith looked on in disbelief, Eleanor reached into her briefcase once again, pulling out her secure government-issued phone, the one reserved for judicial emergencies. With calm precision, she dialed, and the voice on the other end was familiar. "This is Judge Washington," she said, her tone now professional. "Connect me to Chairwoman Richards immediately." The passengers, who had been listening in silence, began to stir. They knew something was happening. They knew that this wasn't just about a flight attendant's mistake. This was about something much bigger. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Meredith was still trying to whisper urgently to Davis. "Who's Chairwoman Richards?" she repeated, panic creeping into her voice. Davis, now clearly realizing the severity of the situation, answered, "Margaret Richards, head of the National Airline Association." The realization began to sink in. Meredith's smugness, her sense of control, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't just any passenger. This wasn't just any woman she had mistreated. This was someone with the power to bring the entire airline to its knees.